Hello and welcome from my little reading space here in Vienna. My name is Luise. I'm a literature student and writer, and I want to talk about a lot of books that I read and listened to as audiobooks last year in 2024. And I'm going to tell you all about my favorite books and my least favorite books and everything in between, as opposed to many bookaholic or bibliophile people, however you want to call them. I'm not someone who writes down what they read. I'm not using any kind of platform to have an overview of all the books that I read. I used Goodreads for a while and it really stressed me out because I'm a slow reader, and I realized that people have their wild goals of like reading 100 books a year or something, and I'm just very glad when I read about 10 books a year or something. I read a lot more, in fact, in 2024 because I include audiobooks now, and I've opened this door for myself. But since I did not write down what I exactly read and when I read it, I might miss out on some books. This is the situation. But I did make a few notes, so I have my laptop here with me, so maybe glancing sideways sometimes to have a look at my notes. Okay, let's get into it. At the beginning of last year, I started reading Kafka on the Shore by Haruki Murakami, and I have mentioned this book quite a few times on this channel because it took me a very long time to finish it, not because I didn't like it, but just because there were a lot of other books that I squeezed in between. I must say it left me with a lot of mixed feelings. I think this is the case with Haruki Murakami in general. All in all, I think Haruki Murakami has a very beautiful and poetic language. I absolutely love reading it. I dive into it. It's easy to read. A lot of very uncanny scenes where I almost got a little uncomfortable, maybe a little anxious reading them, because the way they were described, it felt so intense and real. So that was really well done, but also sometimes hard to read it because there were some very graphic scenes. That was something that I was struggling with. Some of those scenes that were just a little bit too much for me, where I felt like I don't need these descriptions in that way. And I've had these problems with Haruki Murakami before, that especially his sex scenes are so odd sometimes, and it makes you so uncomfortable reading it. I wrote down in my notes, which I think is very well put. It's a book where you constantly search for meaning and want to know what the bigger picture is behind the metaphors, but I'm not sure it's possible to decipher or if it's necessary even. I do like fantastical elements and this sort of genre, but sometimes it was a bit much. But I also liked how it made me feel at the same time, because it was so different and so strange. Why this strangeness made it difficult for me sometimes was because it's hard to identify with the characters because they are so abstract. I'm in between 3.5 and 4 stars out of 5, but I think I'm going with 4 stars because I still think it's good. It's really good. Another great book I read this year was, or last year, it's already 2025, Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. And I'm very happy I read this. Actually, someone at the library gave it back, and I had a little bit of time in between because it wasn't a busy day, so I started browsing through the book and started reading. And at the beginning I felt like I don't know if I'm gonna enjoy it that much because it's a stream of consciousness. It was hard to follow the characters. It also jumps in between the characters a lot, so I had a hard time to really keep up with the story, but I really started enjoying it. So I took the book home and read the full book. The language was just beautiful. I loved it so much. It was so well put together. I wrote down in my notes, the book is full of possibilities and open story that are never fulfilled. And there is this one character, Elizabeth, and she is young, and there are so many possibilities for how her life might continue, but you only get this short glimpse of everyone's life and story. I would say it's a 4 out of 5 because it was a little bit confusing sometimes, but I really enjoyed the language. Next up, and another 4 out of 5 I would say, or maybe 4.5 out of 5 even, is Blue Sisters by Coco Mellors, and I have seen this author's name all over the bookstores and libraries, and I really wanted to read something by this author. The case with very popular books or authors is that sometimes you don't understand the hype. I will talk about a few books where this is the case, but it did not happen with Blue Sisters because I really did like this book. It was very special. I listened to it as an audiobook and it was very engaging. So the premise is there are 4 sisters and one of them is dead. This is not a spoiler, it happens at the beginning, and you get to see the perspectives of each of the living sisters and how they cope with the death of their sister, like individually and also together. They all struggle with different addictions on different levels and different scales. It's definitely character driven, but the characters are so well made, also very distinct, so it's super interesting to follow them along and to get to know them and their stories. The language was rather simple. There was kind of more telling than showing, so sometimes a little bit over descriptive in my personal view, but as I said, the characters were so interesting that it didn't matter too much. Also, making a dead character feel kind of alive through the other characters. This really worked out with this book, so you got a feeling for the dead sister and who she was and what place she had within this sisterhood. One more thing that was really well made was the dialogues. I love them so much, and there is a lot that you can do wrong with dialogues. The next book, I'm not 100% sure when I read this, but I think it was 2024, and I have mentioned it so many times on this channel. You might have heard me talk about it before. It's Mad Ship by Robin Hobb. For anyone who is into fantasy literature, this is absolute gold. I don't know why this is so underrated. I mean, maybe because it's quite old. It was first published in 1998. This is probably my favorite book of the year 2024. It's a 5 out of 5. It's a masterpiece. I'm not going to dive into this because I already talked about it, and once I read the other 2 books in this series, I will definitely talk about it again. Another book with 5 out of 5 stars. It's by an Austrian author, Hans Platzgumer. The title is Großes Spiel. I do not think that there is an English translation yet, but I hope there will be because it's an absolute recommendation. But I already talked about this book in a different video because I read this at the beginning of 2024, I think. The story is set in Japan, and it dives into the history of the country. I don't know much about Japanese history, but just from reading the book, it seems as if it was very well made. So this is a wild mix of genres. I read a lot of different things. I'm not including any university books, so there's obviously other stuff that I read as well, more Austrian literature actually, but I'm now currently only including the books that I read for my pure personal joy. So let's go back to fantasy literature. I read The Atlas Complex this year, which is the 3rd book in the series by Olivie Blake, and I think the most problematic thing here is is the fact that I have the trilogy. They are not the same size, and it is really infuriating. Like, why? So now that I've read the whole series, I must say the 3rd book is probably the weakest, but it's still quite good. I really like the series. At first I thought it's maybe not my thing, might be for a younger audience, but it was actually quite philosophical and very thought-provoking also at times, so I did like that. The thing is with all 3 books that it left me with so many questions and quite confused sometimes. It might be a language barrier, I don't know, I read it in English, but I would say my English is decent and not too bad. But yeah, there were a lot of aspects that I absolutely did not grasp. The plot is important in this book, but more so the characters, so I would say it is definitely character driven. There are some love stories, and this brings me to the next point. Why is everyone in this book kind of sexually or romantically involved with each other, and there is like a vibe with every single character like in between them? That was just really almost a little bit ridiculous and not very believable. I was like, when did those two characters started to have a romantic relationship? I felt a little bit left behind, and I think I said the same thing when I reviewed the second book. You always feel like the characters in the book know more than the reader, but you never get to know the information. So I would say it's a 3.5 out of 5, but I definitely would recommend it. It was a very nice series, all in all. What I really enjoyed, and what I have to say, is the different thought experiments, also the philosophical approach and playing with time and space. That was, yeah, very nicely made. But then I have one last question at the end. How is the mermaid moving on land? It really annoyed me that there was this mermaid figure and all of a sudden she was on land, and maybe I did not grasp something that was happening, but how was it possible? Now that we talked about fantasy and romance, let's talk about romantasy. It's a genre that I did not really care about. When I went to the Leipziger Buchmesse, this is a very huge book fair in Leipzig, I realized that there were certain booths where people just stood in a queue, just like kilometers long, and I was wondering what is so interesting about this booth. What are they selling? What kind of books are so interesting? And it was romantasy. So I thought, I have to get into this. I have to see what is this all about. So I read one of the most famous books at the moment. I listened to it as an audiobook. It's Fourth Wing. And I must say, there is a part of me that definitely enjoyed it. I also listened to the second book, I think Iron Flame. But there is also a part of me that is like, maybe I did waste a little bit of my time there. But I must say, because I'm also going to talk about Akota, A Court of Thorns and Roses. And Fourth Wing is not as bad, in my personal opinion. I think if any one of you enjoys romantasy, don't take this too seriously. I think if you enjoy it, just go for it. It's just not for me, I think. And since I'm a literature student and I have it in me to overanalyze things, I'm also gonna do this with this book now, even though it's not necessary. Fourth Wing is a story with dragons and a lot of romance, obviously. So you have these young adults, and they are in this school where they are trained to be warriors, and they bond with dragons, and then they kind of fight for their country. Yeah, I have to get my notes closer for this because I have a lot of thoughts here. The language was really bad. Let's say it the way it is. It wasn't anything special. It was using a lot of like young vocabulary, also lots of swear words. The main character was using the word fuck so many times. It was really annoying to me personally. And then there were also some very, very banal phrases that made it unwillingly funny in situations that probably weren't supposed to be. Like, my blood turns to ice. I don't know how many times this was said in the books, or my heart leaps, or his eyes darkened. We are only getting the main character's perspective, which is interesting, but in this case it was a bit boring. Also, it did not allow the whole universe to unfold. I really did not grasp the full capacity of this universe with the dragons and everything. Yeah, it was a bit limited in my opinion. Also in the second book, like there is potential, but it's not fully used. And then we come to the characters, and as I said, the main characters was a bit too flat for me, and there were so many interesting side characters that really just didn't get enough attention, even in the second book. And obviously, we need to talk about the love interests here. There is her best friend Dane, and then there is the other guy, Zadie. He's like this super dark and sexy and like mysterious guy who has all his secrets. Obviously, it's so typical, like very, very stereotypical and problematic actually. Here, I think it gets a little problematic. It's this whole thing of he is very mysterious, he doesn't properly talk to her, she is this sort of helpless girl that he needs to save. It's that trope, and I think I'm very bored of that. I don't want to listen to that anymore. She does become a lot stronger, and she has her own will, obviously, but I still think that their relationship was a bit toxic, and Satan, I don't know. I really don't know. He's a red flag, honestly. Like, learn how to communicate, do some therapy, please. And the thing that is problematic is that they are, like, also, most of the male characters are so overprotective and very possessive, and I did not like reading that. I'm like, yeah, I'm over that. I don't need that. I think the sex scenes, because romantasy is very spicy most of the time, and the sex scenes were just, what was that, honestly? Because I think it was quite tasteless. What I wrote down about this was, since we are dissecting it to its core, why are the sex scenes so explicit and graphic, but there is absolutely no mention of protection? Like, is she going to have a baby in the third book? Seriously? Especially for a younger audience, I actually do think that it would have been nice to just mention it at least once. I did like the dragons. I definitely loved the dragons. I would give this book a 2.5 out of 5. Very different with A Court of Thorns and Roses. I really think it was a waste of time. I'm so sorry. I know that a lot of people like it. I also saw a video recently by a booktuber who loved it so much, and it became her comfort book. But I heard from a lot of people that the first book is absolutely trash, not great, and you have to get through the first one and also the first half of the second book until it gets good. But I'm not gonna take this time to get that far, because I have absolutely no desire to know what happens to the characters. The book starts very interesting. I think the atmosphere was so nice, and it's so inviting and special. I felt like this world has so much to offer. It was mythical and full of secrets, but it absolutely lost its momentum once that kind of monster or fairy, so it's all about fairies in this book, I didn't mention that, when this monster or fairy turns up and takes the main character with him, and the characters were quite flat. It was so boring. It was so boring. I did not see a motivation in the main character's actions. She was just there. She was very passive. That monster fairy thing, Tamlin, obviously has a love story with the main character Farah, which was just the most boring. And yet again, he rescues the poor woman who is so helpless without him. Oh, and she has to stay with him so she can survive. There was absolutely no chemistry between them. What is this? But of course there is this dark guy showing up, like this mysterious guy, because we need a mysterious guy with lots of secrets, and you know, this person who is like a little bit misunderstood and who went through so many difficult times and whatnot. And that other guy also saves her because she can't do it on her own. Poor young woman. Their sex scenes are I did not feel the chemistry at all, as I already said, and they keep saying things like, "Don't stop." If I don't stop, I won't be able to stop at all. What does that mean? You don't have control over yourself? Like, excuse me, that's very, very problematic here. Unfortunately, Akota is not more than 1 star for me. This footage is way too long, but we are not done. Last but not least, I'm going to mention a few books that I DNF'd, which does not mean that I did not like them, but there are various reasons why I DNF'd them. So I started listening to Under the Whispering Door. It is very slow paced, funny scenes, and I absolutely liked the story. It's about this man who dies, and then he's kind of a ghost, and he is supposed to transition to whatever comes afterwards. Yeah, he has a bit of a hard time doing so, and he's a very unlikable person, but it's so funny. It just wasn't the right time for me to listen to this. I was a little bit bored, and I couldn't concentrate while listening, so maybe it was because of the audiobook, or because it just wasn't the right time. Maybe it was that specific story, but I did like the writing style, so I'll try to either get back to this story or read another one by this author. I started reading Fraud by Zadie Smith. This is the German version. I did not come very far. I don't know if you can see it. I started reading this with 2 friends. We have a book club and none of us really enjoyed it, so we decided to DNF it. It felt very wrong. I've never read anything by Zadie Smith, and I think one of the most difficult things for me was that the chapters were so short. It was exhausting. Whenever you felt like you were kind of diving in, you were immediately pulled out again into the next chapter. It felt like this sort of. It was very bumpy and very uncomfortable, like stumbling through the story. Okay, now we're coming to the last book. I also DNF this, but not because I didn't like it. I actually really loved it. It's this book. I don't know the English title. In German, it's Das achte Leben für Brilka by the author Nino Haratischwili, and it is set in 1900 and it follows along several characters with their very heavy and traumatizing stories. It was very hard to read this like on a mental level. That was not purely the reason I stopped reading it, but I started reading this for another book club and we had the meeting where we discussed it, and I was not even nearly finished because it has a lot of pages. I went to the book meeting and we discussed it. There were no spoilers, so I felt like, yeah, I'm definitely gonna continue reading. But then afterwards there were so many other books where I felt like they are kind of more pressing because I need to read them for uni, so I put it aside, and that was a big mistake because it was so hard to get back to it because it has so many pages, and I felt like it's such a project, and I'm gonna wait for a more suitable time where I have more capacity. But this time it did not come. I really hope that I'll have the motivation to keep reading because it was so well written, beautiful language. Thank you so much for sticking around. I hope this book talk was interesting to you, and I would love to hear what your favorite and least favorite books were of 2024. And yeah, maybe you read some of the books that I mentioned. It is time to finish my tea and read some more books, but actually for university now. So I hope you have a lovely reading time, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.